Well, I want to welcome you all here. I'm Lou Wagner. I'm one of the senior fellows in the Association of the U.S. Army. And I'm here today for education because I don't know anything about this. I do know about the synthetic training environment, but I'm not an expert on the geospatial. And I just want to tell you, no exams at the end, because I don't want to fail it. But I will listen carefully. But we do have a great group here today. As you know, we have a number of these contemporary military forums, primarily for education. And this is just one of them, but it is something that the Army, if you were present at the, how many were present at the chief's speech today? Not too many. If you listen to him, he talked about innovation, and particularly innovation in training. He's putting a lot of emphasis on the soldiers in the Army and trying to improve the training of them to do a better job. At one time, I was the commander of Fort Knox, and training and combat developments were our primary missions. But training was the thing that we never had a good handle on, in my view. We did our best to train them the best way we could. We had a lot of experience from the people that, like myself, that had served in Vietnam, but we were not up to speed on the latest technology and training. And that's one thing that the Army is trying to do. That's extremely important, because you can get the brightest young people, but if you don't understand that they all have a cell phone in their hip pockets, a laptop in their backpacks, and they speak a different language than they did 20 and 25 years ago, we're not going to get ahead. And that's one thing that the current staff of the Army is working hard on. And I think what we're going to hear about today are some things that are really innovative in training to improve it. I'm going to turn it over now to Mr. Blom, who's going to be working here, and with General Walker, who will run this hearing. At the end, after they speak and the people up here, they introduce them, you will have an opportunity to ask questions. So ask them tough ones. Please do that. Thank you very much.
Ask Cattery the tough ones.
So back to the future. When I first started my career, in the very beginning, I worked for the Communication Electronics Command. About the same time, General Wagner was the commander of Army Material Command, so I didn't realize until we were talking before that he's one of my old bosses. So now I have to do well. Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming to our panel.
I think you meant previous bosses, not old bosses.
Geospatial data. You know, what is it? I think it sounds complicated sometimes when we use the term geospatial data, but you all use it every single day. You probably all use Google Maps to get here to the conference, Waze at some point to avoid accidents or police on your commute to work, Yelp or some other travel app to find a restaurant close to where your hotel is when you're on travel. You've also been a provider of geospatial data. If you don't know it, if you have your GPS on your phone, you are providing geospatial data for all those apps to work better. And so you're both a user of geospatial data and a data source. Now, this panel is going to explore today how Army uses geospatial data today and the great opportunity we have with this evolution of 3D data for us as we go into the future for tomorrow. So for the Army, I'm responsible for the Army Geospatial Enterprise. I am the Geospatial Information Officer for the Army, and in that position, I'm part of the Headquarters Army staff, where I'm responsible for developing and maintaining the geospatial policies for the Army. I'm also the director of the Army Geospatial Center and the Geospatial Research Laboratory. We work closely with NGA here on the panel, our service and coalition partners, and our acquisition partners to both collect data. We provide geospatial analysis, system standards direction, and system integration support, as well as developing geospatial science and technology. Geospatial has been an important part of our Army since the very beginning. If you weren't aware, George Washington was a surveyor and a mapper. He actually mapped Old Town Alexandria right down the road. He did that obviously before he became our commander-in-chief. But that geospatial foundation has been there since the beginning of our Army. But we've come a long way from those auspicious days and those auspicious beginnings. And technology has certainly evolved from those originally hand-drawn maps in the days when our sensor was a scout on horseback. Enter digitization, global positioning system, sensors that include LiDAR. Today's geospatial mapping and products are key to our intelligence and mission command systems. Today, geospatial data enables and is critical to all the warfighter functions. If you think about it, we enable mission command, route planning, protection, intelligence, and fires, all rely on basic terrain information. And we can't get to geospatial intelligence without a foundation of geospatial data. We collect data on things such as the width of roads, the loads of bridges, and the types of soil that we maneuver over, just to name a few. We're developing technologies, map-based mission planning capabilities, algorithms to better use geospatial data to help enhance position and navigation in the absence of GPS, and how to integrate geospatial data into soldier-worn augmented reality devices, all in support of the evolving multi-domain operations. We've worked hard to create this geospatial enterprise that is open architecture and standards-based, and we have come a long way and have better data available on the battlefield than ever before. And today, for readiness, along with our partners at NGA, we're collecting and making available more data than ever before around the globe, coming from collection systems such as our Buckeye and airborne platform that we collect data for the COCOMs, and as well as more and more commercial data. So we must be done. Innovation's complete. Not a chance. The advent of 3D data has been coming for some time. We've been extracting some 3D data from some of our Buckeye collects for some years now. But the availability of 3D products from both space and the proliferation of UASs collecting data at the edge really provides an opportunity to provide enhanced data at the edge for our warfighters. And then if you look at the advances in the gaming community and how they use geospatial data for the gaming experience, how we can use that for our training, and we'll hear more about that today. So now we see the opportunity of using the same common data products across the training community and the operational community, which is so critical for why you need to listen to the folks up here today that's going to talk about, because these are the team members that are working to bridge that gap between those two separate, traditionally separate efforts, the geospatial, the geography, which is about mapping and precision, and the visualization that comes into the gaming environment. But we can now tie those together in training and operational systems. You'll hear about the vision of one world terrain as an Army goal towards that end. We'll do that as an enterprise approach, and it's a starting point for us to figure out the benefits and challenges of integrating into a network architecture for a common picture that supports the warfighter. You'll hear about some of the challenges integrating these technologies and these large data sets in a tactical battlefield, the need for data architectures, storage and processing capabilities, and the demands on tactical communications transport systems. You'll hear how NGA is looking at 3D data like the rest of the geospatial enterprise that they manage for all of the department and as an enterprise asset. And then finally, you're going to hear how industry is poised to develop and deliver technologies and innovation solutions for us to move forward. But in the end, we're only going to do this through partnership, not only through the panel members up here and our organizations, but the acquisition community, the PEOs and PMs that deliver capability for the Army. So I'm excited to have you here today, and I'm excited for General Walker to moderate this panel, and look forward to your questions.
All right, thanks, Mr. Blum. I'm Keith Walker. I'm your friendly moderator for our panel, and I thought we want to get to your questions as soon as we can, so I'll cover the venue as how we wanted to set this up. First, I'll lead off with asking each panel member a toss-up question, if you will, and they will introduce themselves and address that question. We'll go down the line, so you'll hear from everybody briefly, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So there's two ways you can do this. One is you see the microphones here, and if you want to ask a question, go straight to the microphone. You know, wait till we call on you, and then address your question, please, to the individual that you would like to answer it. But if you don't want to do that, Joyce has some of the cards, And if you just let Joyce know, she'll be available. She can pass you the card, and she'll pass them to me, and I can weave those questions into the format. So you have either option. And then the last thing I have before we get started is, you may not know this, because it's, this panel is very much involved in the AUSA Panel of the Year competition. And if you all would to ask very concise, insightful questions, it would improve our chances of gaining this prestigious award. So with that, I want to go straight to General Gervais. And you are the head of the synthetic training environment for the Army. What does geospatial data have to do with training and initiatives like One World Terrain?
Hey, sir, before I start, I think we just have to manage expectations here. So although we are in the running for the prestigious panel and we need audience participation, I think we also have to understand that we're the only thing standing between them and beer time on the floor. So we just have to keep that in perspective here.
So that means we have time for one more question.
Exactly. Exactly. But hey, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to, be part of this distinguished panel here, and really to come in and talk about One World Terrain. To also finish managing those expectations, I'm probably the least technical terrain person sitting up here at this table, but I have a very unique perspective that I'd like to share with you and tell you why. So my background is, starting in 2016, I was serving as the Deputy Commanding General for Combined Arms Center Training at Fort Leavenworth. And that organization is responsible, if you ask me what it is that organization does, it is responsible for ensuring that, one, the Army has a collective training environment, and then I boiled that down to the perspective of being able to be the user rep and making sure that we were able to replicate the operational environment so units can train. So that's kind of the way I've kind of approached that job. But also, while serving as the DCG for CACT, I was also dual-hatted as a synthetic training environment cross-functional team lead. So I have about 2+ years working dual-hatted as the STE CFT director. But I will tell you that perspective has given me a persistent stare at our current training environment, which is known as the integrated training environment. And that persistent stare has allowed me to understand the limitations of what we could do in our current training environment, what we really needed to do to improve it, and then more importantly, it gave me a persistent stare at the challenge that we had with terrain. And the way I classified our training environment was our Achilles heel was terrain. And it was terrain because the fact of that we were relying on 80s and 90s technology that was all developed in a stovepiped proprietary manner, which we developed an integrating architecture so we could hook things together, but they all use terrain differently. So that created about 57, okay, now 57 was about a year, maybe 2 years ago, so it might be more now, but 57 different terrain formats that we had in the training environment. And then terrain was local for these simulators, meaning that, if you didn't have a database that had, for example, if you were getting ready to deploy to Germany, you didn't have that database. You had your database of your local training area. And I say it was the Achilles heel because when units needed to get terrain to be able to train on and put it in their simulators, okay, we had a challenge in being able to get that terrain. It was a manual process, it was very costly, and then it was very time consuming trying to get all these different formats to line up so we could train. So my version is terrain has always been our Achilles heel in the training because we could not provide commanders, soldiers, and units the terrain that they needed to be able to fight on. So, as we looked at this, I kind of looked at, what was a way that we could approach this? And, One World Terrain, and I'll just describe it like this. We named it One World Terrain because we just wanted to get to one 3D format that was in a commercial standard that we could take any kind of data that was out there, run it through a process, and be able to put it in commercial standards and make it platform agnostic. Okay, that means game engine agnostic. Wherever we had to ingest it, it was able to be ingested rapidly and quickly versus having to line up 57 different terrain formats. So, we called it one because we just wanted one in our simulations and our simulators. What we didn't realize, though, was one was going to become more than that in terms of 3D terrain, because we do use 3D terrain in our training, in our simulators, to replicate that operational environment. And if you look at it this morning, or at lunch, the CSA said, hey, we need to move out of an industrial age, into the information age. Well, ladies and gentlemen, our terrain, and look, no offense up here, guys, I'm the provocative one, our terrain right now, it is an industrial age process. It is manual. We have very rudimentary. Units are still trying to struggle. How do we be responsive to units? How can they collect the terrain that they need and quickly put it in either their simulators or simulations or even their mission command information systems? Because, having relevant terrain at the time that you need it is very important. I've had several general officers who said, the most frustrating thing to me in theater, like, for example, the Battle of Mosul, General Townsend, he would tell me, Maria, I could see that we destroyed that building, but I would come and look at my mission command information systems, and there it was standing. And we needed to be able to be responsive and be able to make that change as we did it. Now, so we started One World Terrain just to address our training shortfall. What we have found is we've developed this this One World Terrain process, from collection, processing, to storage, distribution, to also application, and making it agnostic. What we have found is that as we have taken it, and we've taken the prototype and we put it in the hands of users, so Naval Special Warfare SEAL teams, Army Soft to include Tier 1, also 24 Marine battalions, Army divisions, Army Asymmetric Warfare Group. What we have found is that they looked at it from training and how it could be value added for training, and they've now come back to us and said, do you realize this has application for, no kidding, operational tactical use? And then as we were developing the integrated visual augmentation system, we quickly realized that, hey, 3D terrain could be very value added to this piece of kit that's going to be a train, rehearse, and fight piece of kit. So we're seeing the need, and the units are coming back to us and saying, here are all the different things that you can do with it. So that was one. And then our Army senior leaders started asking me, going, could we truly have one world terrain, or you could say one 3D format, that could meet training, operational, targeting? And then we started working with our partners in the Air Force, in the 363rd ISR and the Air Combat Command, and also the Joint Staff, who's trying to look at how do they automate 3D terrain for targeting. So there's a need. It's a compelling need. It's coming from the field. And so we know there's challenges with it because we have no, 3D terrain is in its infancy. We're just now seeing what it can be used for. There's no 3D terrain strategy, verification and validation and tools, but we're partnering with our great partners over at NGA and AGC as we're trying to work through this. We know there's challenges with bandwidth and how do you move and store all of this, but at the end of it, you can't deny the groundswell that's coming from the force because they see the value that's added from being able to use this type of 3D terrain. So with that, I'll pause and turn it back over to you.
Thanks, General Gervais. Okay, the next toss-up is for Ms. Garcia. How can NGA support the Army and other services in modernizing geospatial data analysis and delivery to meet the needs of the user?
All right, thank you so much. Hopefully you can all hear me. Before I get started, I really want to thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel representing NGA. It's really an honor to be here on stage with these incredibly accomplished panelists, talking about geospatial requirements in the synthetic training environment. So at NGA, we're constantly striving to deliver persistent, accurate, secure, and timely geospatial intelligence, or GeoInt, to our partners. In my role as the LiDAR and high-res 3D branch chief in the Office of Sciences and Methodologies, my team is really engaging with industry, academia, and IC, and our DoD partners in order to drive investment in 3D capabilities, like LiDAR and structure for motion. And we're partnering with users to identify their needs and help them deliver solutions that they need when they need them. But I'm not the only one at NGA doing this. We are really, our whole agency is focusing on developing innovative ways to answer partner needs. So my colleagues across NGA are pushing forward GeoInt capabilities in areas like, artificial intelligence and machine learning, visualization, data science, and even tradecraft development. I really know I speak for senior leadership when I say that the agency is committed to supporting our partners in more accelerated timelines without sacrificing quality and really trying to decrease that decision timeline at both the command and edge. They also understand that we need strong partnerships, like the ones that we're developing here with all of our partners on stage, and really trying to figure out how we can leverage the community and utilize the community's resources in order to deliver something better for the partners. So to answer the question, I really think one of the biggest challenges in government and industry alike is trying to figure out how much focus should be placed on innovation and modernization to support future needs without losing track of the needs of the users today. So the way we talk about it at NGA is mission today and mission tomorrow. And oftentimes those needs don't align because it's a resource battle. So where are you focusing on, how are you focusing on tomorrow, and how are you continuing to deliver and support partners today? So some examples of this are some of the vertical obstruction analysis or global scale nautical charts we provide, not to mention the strategic level analysis we provide to our IC partners. So we're really trying to take some manually intensive missions and augment them with artificial intelligence and machine learning, but also keeping in mind that there are some mission sets that require low error and high accuracy, and maybe there's some that don't. So how do you tailor your innovation and modernization not only to internal mission needs, but also to the partners' requirements and needs in order that we can meet all of the GeoInt needs of today and tomorrow. A good example is the commitment that NGA has made to Major General Gervais to support the CFT efforts, enabling 3D data for a variety of different purposes. One of the ones she just mentioned. With 3D targeting. So how do we use our own internal research and development as well as the community efforts in order to help get as close as possible to achieving those goals in the timeline established? Additionally, we are collaborating with the TAC developers on improved delivery of 3D data, testing out new capabilities in 3D file formats that will enable quicker delivery of that data from the near edge back to the enterprise and then back out again. Just last year, we also helped them validate the portable reference imagery for targeting. In both of these examples, we had really proactive users who came to NGA with specific requirements and an understanding of the needs of their user communities. And so in my opinion, that's really one of the most important ingredients, is having partners that are not only willing, but that have a good understanding of the needs of their communities and how we can support those needs from that larger enterprise level.
Thanks, Ms. Garcia. Okay, on to General Gallagher for your toss-up. As the network cross-functional team lead, you know firsthand how things work in the tactical environment. What does all this talk of 3D data mean to the tactical mission command and intelligence systems?
Well, before I answer the question, I do want to kind of lead in. I am Pete Gallagher. I'm the network cross-functional team. With my battle buddy Maria there, we've been doing this together. We're kind of two of the original remaining cross-functional team leaders that stood up shortly after AUSA in 2017. So we've been going at it almost a couple years now. And so, I want to kind of give you the context of what we're trying to do in the network and then talk a little bit more about how I think this three-dimensional mapping is so critical to what we're trying to do and how it fits in our network design. So as we try to get the Army the network it needs to fight and win, okay? And as you've heard the chief, he's been beating the drum that winning matters. And we got to win in a contested environment against a peer adversary, okay? And to win in a contested environment where we know we're going to be contested in spectrum, we know we're going to be contested in space, and we know we're going to be contested in cyber, we're looking to ensure that our network backbone, that what we modernize for our Army, our unified network has to be, we have to be, our network transport has to have multi-path connectivity that allows us to provide options down to the tactical edge. So we have what we call assured network transport in a contested environment against that peer adversary. And there's a lot of ways we're going after that problem. But in some cases, we're going to still be operating at a very, we may have to operate in a disconnected, intermittent, and low bandwidth environment, okay? Because hiding from the adversary sometimes means you have to have low bandwidth just to not be seen. And so we're working through a multitude of options in that particular line of effort, okay? So how data flows is absolutely critical. And the size and scale of the bits and bytes that flow through that transport is critical, which is why line of effort 2, which is where a lot of our efforts with Erdek and Gary and his team are focused, is what we call the common operating environment. And for us, that's compute, it's storage, it's applications, you don't have a common operating environment without a common operational picture. And the center of gravity for a common operational picture is the underpinning of standard mapping that's provided by NGA and the geospatial community. Because intelligence drives operations, and it all starts with the intelligence community and everything being interconnected. So what goes under our DSIGs and our platforms and all of our applications, our battle command systems, has the underpinning of a common mapping source. That cannot ever go away in the common operating environment. It's absolutely critical for everything we do. So the center of gravity for the common operating environment, which provides our truly common operational picture to fight on echelon, has to have the underpinnings of a common standard mapping, and whether it's 3-dimensional, 2-dimensional, and we're hoping that as the community works together, they have the right algorithms and compression standards that allows that data to flow very efficiently over an environment and over a network transport where you've got limited pipes, okay? So in the tactical space, pretty significant work in what we're calling LOE2, or the common operating environment. Then the two other things that are our lines of effort that are related but that's slightly different, okay? The next line of effort for us is what we call joint and coalition interoperability. Everything we do as an Army, it has to comply with joint standards. We've got to be able to connect to our coalition partners. And so, we got to make sure collectively that one world terrain is not one-off terrain, that it's completely synchronized and energized. So commonality, common standards, common operating environment is common to all, because we will never fight alone. And so we just got to, and that's one of the big concerns that we have as we go forward. And our last line of effort, which is less about bits and bytes and data flow, it's about the mobility and survivability of our command posts. Okay? We don't want to have to, lug around with us a 50-foot container to ensure that we can do the map data in a tactical environment just so we can do the rehearsals. We want to make sure our edge devices are powerful enough, small enough, light enough, and capable enough to ensure that we can do this on echelon. So those are some of the things we're working towards. What underpins all of those lines of effort that we're focused on as a network cross-functional team is the horizontal integration efforts between all the CFTs. So long-range precision fires, okay? Precision matters. Sensor to shooter, a network that allows target acquisition from that sensor, wherever that sensor is. The only way you're going to have precision is common mapping, okay? And sensor to shooter requires me to make sure we got the network transport in place. So whoever pulling the trigger puts warheads on foreheads, okay? That's what we're trying to do, okay? It's hitting the target you intend to hit, okay? For next generation combat vehicles, for future vertical lift, when those guys are flying into an A2AD environment, or we've got manned and unmanned teaming in our robotic vehicles and our platforms, all that's got to be interconnected as well. And so how they go and where they go and who's tracking who on the battlefield, again, it has to have the underpinnings of a common map standard. So that is absolutely critical for all the cross-functional teams. Air and missile defense, the same thing, okay? Where we're really making a lot of progress with Maria and her team and Dave Hodney and his team is that down at the soldier level with the soldier lethality. A lot of work that's going in right now with our integrated tactical network and with where General Hodney and his team are going with really improving the visualization tools for the soldiers to allow them to have the ability to sense targets and stay connected on what we call the Common Tactical Assault Kit. It's the mission assurance tools, basically the mission command tools at the lowest tactical echelon. So where they're going with IVAS, the Integrated Visual Augmentation System, is going to have the same kind of common standard tool set that we're currently using in the Net Warrior system today, which is absolutely rudimentary in what we're trying to deliver on what we call the Integrated Tactical Network. So, you know, the Chief also talked about people, how important the people are. It's that soldier on point that has to have at his fingertips the ability to see where he's at, where his enemies are at, and be able to train as he fights. But when he's in the fight, he's got to win, okay? And so what we owe them is a network that works, allows that to happen, and the commonality of mapping that allows everybody to kind of, you know, operate on one frame of reference, and that's absolutely critical. Where I see the challenges right now is there's already a heavy demand, you know, for bandwidth on, you know, and regardless of how you skin it. If you're talking about map data flowing through, you're talking about augmented reality going over the network, or you're talking about, you know, things like the medical community wanting to do telemedicine. There's a lot of demands on a very, you know, already kind of saturated network. So we're working through what are the options. And I think where we can use industry's help going forward, I believe, is making sure that, you know, we're attacking kind of the next ridgeline in terms of compression algorithms and the ability to kind of be as efficient as possible when we're trying to operate in that disconnected, intermittent, and low bandwidth environment.
Thanks, Daryl Gallagher. Now, after Mr. Zaworski addresses his introductory question, y'all will have a much better idea about what each panelist, where their lane is in the geospatial enterprise, and then we'll start taking questions. And again, you can either ask questions directly at the microphone or indirectly. Joyce has got the cards there. Just raise your hand and she'll bring you a card. So, Mr. Zaworski, you've heard all the Army and NGA talk about where they want to go. How do you anticipate industry will respond to these challenges?
Well, that's an easy toss-up. We're going to support the challenges, obviously.
Hey, before he does that, we had a running vote, okay, before this thing actually started. Now, General Walker talked about this being the panel of the forum here, okay? And we are, I think, after hearing Maria and Gary, I think we're definitely in the running. But Kateri, you know, had kind of an informal assessment before we came in on who the best dressed panel member would be. And she thought she was a shoo-in, but I actually think it's Isaac, okay? But save your vote till after the panel's over, okay? But look, I just want to lead that in, okay?
The general officers always take it home.
All right.
We'll just say that. All right. There, hey, you know, it's important. So, I just want to start by saying that I'm extremely honored to be at this table with all of these extremely distinguished people whom I look up to so much in my daily life. So I am wildly honored to be here. And I'm even more honored to be talking about something that, as General Gervais can probably tell you, I'm extremely passionate about. So I have a tendency to get a little over-enthusiastic when we start talking about how to actually try to attack some of these problems. I'm a technologist at heart who is probably, I feel pretty confident in saying this, I'm probably the only one at the table who can say that I can blame Craigslist for the reason that I'm at this table. So I'm actually a mechanical engineer. I used to build race cars, and it just so happens that all the work that I've ever done in my life, going back to when I was 15, is all IT, high-performance computing, and image processing. And via the wonders of Craigslist, I somehow ended up coming out of grad school at the only startup company in Portland, Oregon that was doing ISR work for JSOC and SOCOM. So I promptly got an offer from them that said, hey, how would you like to support a new science project of an airborne reconnaissance platform? Check out in Las Vegas for a few months, and then you'll be headed to Afghanistan. So here, me, a West Coast kid, civilian, didn't know anything about this community whatsoever, ends up 6 weeks after I graduate from grad school in Afghanistan for what was supposed to be a 2-month deployment, and promptly ended up as a year the first time around, and
3 hour tour. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Colin knows. And it's amazing the career trajectory that's come out of that, but the kind of amazing thing for me coming out of that is that I distinctly remember the first few months that I was sitting in a plywood box in Afghanistan, and we were running some interesting hyperspectral sensors, some imaging sensors, and we were co-located with the Buckeye team at that point in time. So this goes all the way back to my early days with AGC as well. And I was sitting in the back of a cardboard box or a plywood box with a supercomputer, taking all of the power that they could give me off of a generator, and trying to figure out how I could take geospatial content and turn it into something that was actionable for the JSOC guys who are going out every night to go and try and do something, right? And that was the first introduction to me of just how important the third dimension really is in the world that we work in, and particularly from a geospatial perspective. So it's funny, the comments coming up to me have been great. So I've heard, I mean, One World Terrain has a place that's close to my heart, the whole concept of this terrain that underpins everything. General Gallagher hit it home with the common mapping source, right? Enabling the transition from manual to automation, or enabling the transition from the industrial age to the information age, and beating it home with the precision matters component of this. So being a geospatial nerd, I can tell you, there was a big transition in the remote sensing world when the fight transitioned from Iraq to Afghanistan. You know what that transition was? The transition was the fact that Iraq was pretty darn flat. So when we tried to take remotely sensed imagery and composite it together and turn it into maps that were pretty accurate, we could fudge things pretty well in flat map space, and we got pretty decent accuracy out of what we were trying to do. Turns out Afghanistan is not so flat. So when you try and take a bunch of data that's being collected from all these airborne platforms, and you try and actually register and fuse it together, and try and do that in 2D map space, you got all these misalignment errors, and you could never get the product accurate enough or to look the way that the real world looked. And the reality there is that the world is 3 dimensions, right? And the further we want to keep driving all of our capabilities down to the human scale, the further we want to drive our intelligence analysis down to what individual people are doing in the world, the further we want to support our troops in environments like urban megacities, potential battlefields of the future, the more that third dimension becomes a critical reality that we have to acknowledge, we have to embrace, and then we have to be able to support. And so one of the really amazing things from the industry perspective, and it's fascinating for me as being somebody who's kind of caught in between the two, is that the commercial world is facing a lot of the same problems, right? So everything that Director Bloom talked about in the beginning with the cell phones that we carry around in our pocket, the things we take for granted that are geospatial inherently in our daily lives, where we don't acknowledge, we don't use the same language, we don't call it GeoInt when we're at home or when we're using Google Maps to figure out how to get the best route to get to the convention center when the traffic is miserable like it is. But commercial industry is coming to recognize a lot of these exact same problems. They have a different set of use cases, they have different constraints on collection and where they get their data from, but ultimately they're all driving back towards this idea that we need accurate geospatial data that is timely in order to support understanding of how people are interacting with the environment that we live in, and to understand how we can interact with that environment and all of those other people. And so the good news is that there's a ton of industry investment that is being made into attacking a lot of these problems. Sometimes it can be hard to find that because there are different syntaxes, different languages, different problem sets altogether, or a lot of the people who are trying to tackle those problems may not be traditional supporters of the defense community or people who interact with the defense community. But that's one of the things that I have been most impressed with from the cross-functional team perspective is the willingness to kind of reach out beyond the traditional acquisition mechanisms and really look at ways that we can bring capability to bear to support the warfighters, those guys who are out there, guys and gals who are out there doing this right now and who have needs and requirements, where there's capability that we can bring to bear really quickly, and that industry with a little bit of kind of tradecraft and knowledge from the users to understand how we pull things together in order to solve some of these really hard problems, right?
Thanks, Mr. Zaworski. Okay, question times. Anybody have a direct question? Your written questions are pouring in. Sir?
Thanks to the panel. I appreciate the comments about the differences in terrain between the mountainous versus flat. Dr. Bill Doe, former Army engineer officer, did a lot of river crossings back in the Cold War era. My question is that one of the specific components of terrain needs is to understand large-scale, three-dimensional data for hydrologic systems. For example, crossing the Danube River, when it's a dynamic system, the flow changes, you need to not only understand the width, but you have to understand the depth in order to understand the flow of the river, the discharge, which radically affects whether or not you can cross major river systems. What is our current capability in the Army to understand how flow changes, depth changes, three-dimensional aspects of river systems are going to affect our operational exercises this March when we deploy numerous brigades to Europe?
And is there anyone specific that you're addressing your question to, please?
It goes to Cattery.
Not
It
it.
goes to Cattery.
I'll start with the two general officers.
Maria, you want to take it?
I would actually turn that one over to Gary, because he is the expert on it.
I was going to defer
Yeah.
to the kind gentleman to
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
right, who
I mean, he actually works for the Corps of Engineers. He is our
Yeah.
Army geospatial expert, so,
So
expert.
I've been an Army civilian for 34 years. And I'll tell my boss, General Simonite, I left the Army and I joined the Corps of Engineers. Much different problem set to include, of course, in this nation, water control and water management and the dams. And so we do work on a lot of, in this country, those kind of challenges with the Mississippi Valley systems, and of course it's just getting worse and worse with the amount of dams in this country, not all owned by the Corps, and understanding those water features, that hydrology. I still think that's a gap as we provide more of that data to our armies overseas. And so I think when you talk about is the world mapped, that's a really loaded question. Now, that's a question I ask myself all the time, is the world mapped? It might be imaged. There might be some level of mapping in certain areas. It does not have, I don't think we have, for the Danube as that example, we don't have that data right now because we haven't studied that specific river unless NGA has done so.
Yeah, I was going to add, I completely agree. I think, right, this is one of the biggest challenges in the community is not only understanding terrain, but also, navigation, bathymetry. And I think that those are important requirements, though, that need to really be, what's the word, there need to be advocates for that, the development of that capability, those capabilities. So one of the things that we really work on at NGA and within the NSG, right, the National System of Geospatial Intelligence, is what are the needs that are out there and how can we best capture them and how can we best advocate for the development of technology that will answer those needs. So, there's some work being done in using laser remote sensing to measure water depth. There's other, persistent imaging techniques that you could use in order to measure water height, but it's important that all these requirements really be understood so that the correct technologies can be developed for the partners who need them. I don't know if that helped.
And in Army Geospatial Center, we are focused, in this country, intercoastal navigation, and so collecting that data. And by the way, the data you collect today is wrong pretty soon. And so the recency of the data we collect, and I think it gets to, what the question was kind of leading towards is understanding the behavior of water so you can start predicting how that those depths of those rivers will change over time. And I think it actually ties into some of the modeling and simulation capabilities at some point that we need to evolve.
Yeah, so I'm probably a very simple person as I think about things like this. So as we're thinking through what is it that we need to be able to do exactly what you just said, I often think about who are the other people that are already looking at this in this space already that we ought to be able to glean from. For example, a lot of the stuff that we're seeing right now in being able to get to the accuracy that we need, and I'm talking terrain, not hydrology or anything like that, but you look at the agricultural and mining industry and they are using and being innovative to get after technology to do exactly what you said. So I think what we have to be able to do is capitalize on what is out there, who is using it, why they're using it, and then can that be brought to bear to help us? Because, you know, we're always going to have the challenge of having the most accurate data necessary to inform our planning. We're never going to have perfect information, but the question becomes, what can we leverage to get the best analysis that we need as we're going forward? Because I would submit to you, even when we were in Europe, I'm not sure we had good visibility on the hydrology, the flow rate, but we had partners that we were partnering with and we had ideas. So I think we just have to make sure we're not boxing ourselves in as we're looking out. And I think, Isaac, some of the things you're doing with some other partners, I mean, you're leveraging a lot of that already.
Yeah, and I think it's also really important for the people, the community that's represented in this room to recognize how we can leverage investments that are being made across some of these communities that are kind of nearly adjacent, but also think about them in the context of the unique challenges that face our kind of our community and the warfighter and what we're planning and preparing for, right? So there are a lot of really powerful techniques and technologies for using remote sensing for collecting a bunch of this data and surveying and assessing and keeping tabs on these things that are being generated by different industrial groups. And in a lot of cases, those sorts of techniques are really good for areas where you can get access, right? They may not be directly developed with kind of a mindset towards looking at areas where you don't have access. And that's one of the big challenges that we always face. And so one of the things that I think is really important, and one of these places where a partnership between industry and the government is really important, is that a lot of these commercial industries don't even think about the idea of not having access. But a lot of the techniques that are being generated and applied to remote sensing data for areas that you can collect with specialized sensors and things like that, a lot of those techniques have parallels or can be leveraged or extended to scenarios where you're working off of different sensors that are capable of collecting in denied areas or areas that are kind of more specific to warfighter concerns. And that's one of the places where in my daily life I spend a lot of time bridging this gap between what's the state of the art coming out of industry, academia, et cetera, for data processing, machine learning, deep learning techniques for how to take broad data sets and not just individual data sets. Today it's all a question of how can you leverage multiple different data sets effectively in order to answer individual questions, and how can you take the cutting edge that is being developed in these commercial, academic, UARC locations, a lot of R&D funding by the government too, and how do we bridge that gap towards the national capabilities and the overhead capabilities and some of these crowdsourced. It's an amazing world where you can go on Twitter and you can pull down better, higher resolution imagery of your target from somebody's iPhone than you could ever possibly get from a national asset, right? But figuring out how to find that data, how to accurately correlate it into your picture of the world, your terrain, and then figuring out what it can be used for. Those are really big challenges. And hydrology is a really interesting particular challenge just because it's a world where there is frankly not a ton of investment going. And the Navy by far outspends commercial investment except for oil and gas exploration in certain areas. And there's some really interesting parallels of how you can leverage, actually, Kateri knows a lot about this. So ground truth is really important. NGA as an organization has this incredible wealth of understanding and knowledge of ground truth at a global level that nobody else has. And ground truth can be really powerful in being able to characterize and understand how some of these technologies and data processing techniques can be translated from what we know and can touch and test into worlds that we can't touch and test, and be able to be assured that the products we're generating will be good when and if we have to go there, right?
Can I ask you a question?
I got two right here.
Behind you.
Sir, let me work these here. Gentlemen, I think you were up first.
Yeah.
And we'll work our way up, sir.
Sounds good. So this is for the Major Generals, so I hope y'all doing great today. Great panel so far. My question is in regards to both training and, kind of like how we're going to, I guess, change our training in the future when we deal with near-peer adversaries. So, there's a lot of things, there's a lot of issues that we have to take into account, like near-peer, deception and denial, near-peer DW. How do we train our ISR guys, which, is a limited resource anyway, how do we train them to kind of be prepared for those kind of real-world outages and, just being deceived by the enemy or terrain?
Yeah, hey, so that's a great question, and that's part of the reason why we're going to the synthetic training environment, because as we took a look at our integrated training environment, based on 80s and 90s technologies that we were linking together, what we weren't able to do was come in and clearly replicate what that operational environment would be. So EW, cyber, space, megacities, dense urban terrain, those were all things that we knew we were challenged with. So, and the reason we were challenged with it is because, as you look at it underneath kind of the way that we had orchestrated our current training environment, it wasn't based on an open architecture. We didn't have authoritative data. We didn't have common standards, nor did we have common terrain. So as we look at that and we open that architecture, then what we can do is we can start figuring out how do we actually replicate in the virtual world EW, cyber, space. And that's so in the virtual world, we're already showing that we can do that in our virtual piece, but then in our constructive, which is our larger war game piece, we're able to do that to some degree, not to the same level. Now in the live environment, of course, we're going out and it's live. We're providing the capability EW. We spent the last 2.5 years building up not just EW, cyber, and space with our OPFOR so that our Blue Force could train, but also we've also built up our integrated air defense capability, because you have to present the operational environment, the problem set, and our units have to have the tools to be able to address it, because unless you present that environment, you're never going to get a reaction. The challenge we have right now is, I have somebody that walks out of the control room and says, okay, I'm going to white card you. You've been white carded, this system's being denied. Well, that doesn't teach you the same thing. So one of the reasons we're going to the synthetic training environment is because if we do this, we believe we can replicate this in the virtual, and then if we converge live and constructive, now I got the common thread, all the way through from the soldier on the ground all the way up. So that's a great question. And I've seen the technology out there already. I'm sure you have too, because you're asking the question. I've seen how EW, I've seen cyber, how it's been virtualized, and it really starts with that 3D terrain. And I think for multi-domain operations, and for multi-domain operations, and also as you look at the sophistication of the weapon systems coming in, limitations that we have at home stations right now, because space and all, our weapon systems, what they can do, we can't bring all those enablers to bear. But if we can create this environment that can replicate that environment and deliver it at the point of need, then we can bring all of that to bear and bring in our joint partners and really get after multi-domain operations. That's a tough problem set, but that's part of the reason why we're changing from what we're doing right now to our training environment. And you got to take it away. It's got to have an impact, just like it does in the live, when they know something's happening and they have to respond. Hopefully I answered your question. I'll see if anybody wants to join.
No, I think everything that Maria talked about there, I absolutely agree with. I think the virtual and constructive environments are absolutely key for us to get reps and sets, but there's nothing like fighting through the pain in a live environment as a career signal officer, where you're going to have an outage or you got to fight through. We had a major cyber incident when I was the J6 in Afghanistan, and significant impacts on how to isolate and fight through. And I think what we've been doing with the CTC rotation, Combat Training Center rotations, is actually, forcing the network to be able for forcing units to be able to fight the network and have options, have what we call a PACE plan, a primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency, set of options for commanders, so they have the ability to fight through. Because a lot of times we have too many single points of failure, and we have limited options. And that's really why we're trying to modernize the network that gives us that multi-path connectivity. But I think there's nothing like, feeling the pain in a live environment and actually having to isolate and fight through it.
Yeah, and so I'll just add a couple things. So, so we're linked heavily in with the persistent cyber training environment that's going to seamlessly integrate. We're also with IEWPT, bringing that in, so we have the city environment. But if you look at the 3D terrain and what right now is being able to be laid out, and you look at, like, for example, what some of our commercial partners are using from, like, telecommunication, they're able to get line of sight, they're able to figure out where to best put things, and then in that virtualized environment, I mean, you can shut it off. And I think the great thing, Pete, with kind of linking the virtual and constructive piece, the reps and sets allow you to get that reps and sets. So when you go to that live, you kind of go out into, you go from like graduate to PhD level training and not waste those precious time and resources out there.
There's a lot at stake, right? And we talked earlier about data and how critical data is, and being able to manage and discipline and have the actual staff understand. Sometimes you got to go to minimize, for example. If you're isolated or you only have one link and that link may be a very limited bandwidth. So there's some TTPs that have to be practiced, and you can practice them virtually, you can practice them constructively, but you got to get through, again, white card is one thing, but actually going through the pain of going through it and figuring out how you're going to make that happen, I think, is key.
Ma'am.
I'm Teresa Hitchens with Breaking Defense, and my question is for Major General Gallagher.
Yes.
I want to ask, how big of a barrier is need for bandwidth? Across the Army, there's a widespread recognition there's just not enough connectivity at the tactical level, so
right.
I'm trying to figure out how you fit training priorities into a arena where the bandwidth is already limited.
Yeah, so it's all about, you hit the key word, the P word, priorities. We got to prioritize what matters when, and make sure that if we have the ability to do rehearsals and push things over a tactical network, we absolutely want to do that. But operational requirements on the ground kind of take precedence over all of that. We're never, at least right now, we don't have the capacity we need in terms of data flow, especially beyond line of sight. We're relying very heavily on geosynchronous satellite connectivity, and there's a constellation capacity challenge, and there's also just low bandwidth and a latency challenge. So we're working our way through options, and that's one of the things we're trying to leverage going forward is exploring things in the very near future of leveraging mid-Earth orbit, low Earth orbit satellite constellations in our network transport, which should give us a lot higher capacity and much lower latency in our network backbone beyond line of sight, which would help significantly. We're also connecting some of our command posts. We're leveraging tri-LOS kind of systems, line of sight systems that allow us to have high capacity line of sight capabilities between nodes, and leveraging things like advanced tropo where we can go long range, high capacity throughput to give us multiple options on the network side. Yeah. And we're also exploring things like an aerial tier for range extension and things like that. So working through with the future vertical lift and the aviation community on how do we kind of make sure that we've got, again, multiple options when we have been so reliant, especially over the last 18 years, on geosynchronous satellite connectivity.
Hey, Pete, so let me just add to this. So when you look at the training environment, so it's important to also recognize that a lot of that training environment is going to be relying on the enterprise network, so at our post camps and stations. So we are linked in with CIOG6 on the infrastructure upgrades required so we can reduce latency and some bandwidth. I think secondly, working through, what is the mode of operation that you would use when you go in, whether that's tactical or whether that's for training. So being able to take the terrain for the area that you're in is, typically how we do it already. And then, as you collect terrain and you need to bring it back, that could be asynchronous as you're going through. And then, of course, looking at things on data management, so as you collect that terrain or you have to send them, push that terrain, you're not pushing all of it. You're just pushing the changes that have occurred. Right. So you can get to things like, better compression rates. And so we're looking at all those options. And we've just set up a STI network integration pilot that kicked off 2 weeks ago. It's a testing network. We're pushing data already, cloud down to working with our partners at AGC and ERDIC to push that data to find out bandwidth, latency, where are gaps, what do we need to address. And then we've been working with NGA and AGC on collecting that data, but using things like Snowball, working how do you bring it back into Grid and GridX so that we can use the infrastructure. So we can really figure this out as we're on the go. And Isaac, did you want to add?
Yeah, so the other thing that I would add is that...
You guys just jump in.
So the other thing that I would add is, and this gets back to General Gervais' earlier comment from General Milley, I think, right, about the shift from the industrial age to the information age.
That was
Joe McConville.
McConville, apologies. So one of the other big keys there, as you start to think about how do you develop the TTPs in order to minimize data being pushed around, right? So from my time deployed on the operational side of things, you come to recognize, and we had the affectionate term of the data hustlers, right? So in reality, even today, with all of the investments that have been made, a hard drive on a helicopter is the fastest way to get data to places, right? And as we start even looking at these new kind of network technologies and new infrastructure technologies, edge nodes are just kind of an extension of that concept, right? So there's gonna be data that you don't want to move around, and being able to take a lot of the capabilities, the processes that used to be heavily manual, that required very specialized people and very specialized equipment and technologies, which in yesteryear required a bunch of hard drives getting shipped back CONUS to some lab where you had a bunch of really highly trained people to do stuff for months on end, and then you ship final products back. Shifting that and looking at how we can automate a lot of those production processes, all of those kind of integration, fusion components to a point where they can happen at the edge without needing a ton of highly specialized input, changes the dynamic about where data needs to be and when it needs to be. Because there's the question of how do you utilize the network for training is one thing, but even today we still have this problem of how do we get tactical data back to be able to be used in training afterwards, right? And it's the exact same problem, right? So we need to be able to take data from foundational stores being created CONUS. We need to be able to figure out how to stage it in where it makes sense and only pull down updates and diff sets as they come up. And we need to structure our standards to be supportive of that sort of data flow. This is as much as we all love talking about the wonders of standards organizations, there's a core to this that is data standards and understanding how, in a modern world, we can have data standards that are smart about moving small bits of information in effective and efficient ways.
Yeah, I will also add on and say, and I was talking to Major Gallagher about this before the panel, is...
It's been like 20 years.
Oh,
since
sorry. Well, that award for put my foot in my mouth. General Gallagher and I were speaking earlier. I have to do something embarrassing just to make all the rest of the panel feel better. I strive hard to achieve that in all my public speaking events. So I was going to say, so one of the things that we were talking about earlier is some efforts that NGA is kind of spearheading and really like pushing for new delivery of 3D data. So whether, tiling out data instead of needing to download every single bit as that you need in a whole area. Additionally, we're looking into new data compression algorithms. So both lossless as well as, smart lossy, as it's called, where you're just delivering not only, as Isaac was saying, not just when and where, but also, and for who. So who needs what data and when and where and what is the device they're using. So taking that kind of individualized, tailored approach to not only get the data from the near edge where it's collected, but also then being able to put it in the enterprise and push it back out. So,
and you talk about a paradigm shift here. It's easy to gloss over, but as we start talking about taking some of these functions that have traditionally been done in places with highly specialized people involved, and this gets back to Kateri's earlier discussions of safety of nav products and these things that people's lives depend on, you start talking about targeting at the tactical edge, and you start talking about automating a lot of the data processing to be able to get down to the point where at the tactical edge you can enable warfighters to be able to use the most timely and in many ways the best data. I mean, with some of these capabilities for tactical ISR collection, you're getting data that is seconds old or less than seconds old, that is higher fidelity than anything that you can get elsewhere. And it's no wonder that warfighters have been crying to be able to use that for targeting, for operational use forever. And so one of the challenges that you have, and this is the push-pull, is that traditionally those sensors have been very poor at identifying where that data is on the ground. The geospatial accuracy and precision has not been a highlight of the collection environments. And typically the collection environments are really complex to begin with, right? So if you have a Global Hawk at 50, 60,000 feet collecting full motion video with a 2,000 millimeter lens at a 70-degree slant angle way off to the side, who knows where, right? Just from putting my mechanical engineer's hat on, which I don't get to do very often, that's a really hard technical problem to figure out exactly where that sensor is pointing on the ground. So it's understandable that the accuracy coming straight off those sensors is limited. And so the challenge that's upon us, and this is a challenge from a data processing standpoint, from my perspective, but it's a challenge from a policy standpoint too, is how do you take that data that has really good qualities about it? It's timely, it's high resolution, it's meaningful, it's being collected to support it's there. And how do you enable it? So how do you take that data and geo-register it against something that you know fundamentally to be able to propagate error information from some known trusted source, similar to the way that we've done these things in the past? How do you do that automatically and in real time and in a way that's repeatable enough that the people who are responsible for putting their stamp on these things and enabling us to put warheads on foreheads, that they are comfortable taking that risk, right? That's a huge paradigm shift. And it's one of these ones where I'm extremely happy that Cattery and NGA and this whole team up here are using the partnering word as frequently as they are, because this is a multifaceted problem, and it's not an easy one, and it's going to require a lot of effort, a lot of focus, and a lot of different parties getting involved and being willing to change the way they think, change their risk profiles. But it's doable today, which is the really powerful part. That's the key takeaway. It's doable today, and the warfighters who are out there are crying for it.
So the panel members have said everything I wanted to say, but I'm going to say something anyway. So a couple things I want to foot stop, and I heard, so thank you, Isaac, for saying, hey, today for some of these big data sets, helicopters are the fastest way to move data. So I want to reemphasize that we need, as we think about where we may have action in the future, we need to get the most recent data we can and get that into our systems. So then when we do need to update change detections and things like that, we're sending the minimum amount of data. Because we can all complain about Pete and he doesn't give us enough bits per second we want, but we got to figure out how do we use those bits per second efficiently and effectively. And so the technology development that Cattery talked about at NGA, we're working on that with them. I mean, that is key. But also deciding, I think this is where we need more analytics to decide, yeah, there's been a lot of changes. Yeah. Do we need to send all those changes over this network? What changes are critical and will make a difference in our decision-making process?
I think we nailed that one. General Wagner.
Well, actually, you've answered most of my questions, because my question was, I heard the chief today said we've got to improve our training. And that means from starting with privates, squad leaders, platoon leaders, company commanders, battalion commanders. When I was a commander of Fort Knox, I had a large combat development system. They don't have that anymore. I had many system engineers, and incidentally, all of these system engineers had a maneuver background. So they weren't just SWAT guys and women like you that understood all this stuff. Today, because of what's been going on the last 18 years, if you look at TRADOC, the number of system engineers has gone like this, as compared to what we had in the past, who had background in how to fight and how they could use this data. And what I'm worried about today is, for example, the commanders of the Maneuver Center of Excellence, so that's the, they used to be the Chief of Armor and the Chief of Infantry. I was the Chief of Armor for over 3 years. And that was a normal tour then, about 3 to 4 years, because we were responsible for getting the word throughout the Army on how you had to fight and what you had to do it with. I don't see that capability today, and I'm worried, how are you, and I direct this more to the two major generals up here, how are we going to get this out? Now, I know at the National Training Center now, you've been working on that to train them, but they've got to understand that before they get there, so that they don't spend over half of their time learning how to use the equipment.
Right.
And they need to know on home training how to do that. Is that being looked at, and how are we going to handle that?
So Pete, I'll start from the training perspective. So, sir, to address your question, yes, we are taking a look at that. So, you know, each of the centers of excellence are, as you know, are responsible for not just outlining how they train their regiment, but they're also responsible to to train the rest of the Army and the collective training piece. So as that comes together, that comes into CACT, and CACT works the requirement on behalf of all of the different proponents and centers to ensure that we have that Army collective training piece of it. And that's why, as we looked at our current training environment, we looked at how could we go to the synthetic training environment so that we could really, when we say point of need, and you think about that, I mean, don't think about going to the mission training complex or going to the, as you recall, the big, you know, we have the warehouses full of our simulators and simulations, and we're tied to facilities, we're tied to a lot of contractors. What we're trying to do with the synthetic training environment is make it, you know, the key principles that General Milley approved was it had to be simple. It had to be, you have a user interface that, just like, I don't have my phone, but let me, who has your phone? So you don't get a full-fledged discussion on this, right? Well, yeah, I mean, you get this, and like some of us, we don't understand like 3/4 of the features on it, but we can do the things we need, right?
Yeah.
But these young kids, right? These young kids come in, and it's very easy to use. They understand the concepts, they can use it. So as we're looking at it, it's got to be simple, easy to use. It's got to be point of need. So when we say point of need, the point of need is wherever a soldier or unit needs to be able to train. So no longer standing in line to go get in, you know, line for the simulators that is used. Give them the ability to now pull this equipment down, put it into operation very quick, and then start being able to train in their footprint. That's also for the Guard. So getting this out there is kind of what we're focused on in the cross-functional team, getting that lined up so that we could take this capability, get a deeper distribution down to battalion and company level, because that's what's in our vision. And then that's at home station, and then we also fill out our combat training centers. Because what we have a gap in right now is the chief, General Milley, gave us the mandate that says the world has changed. The only way I can really drive cultural change really quick is at our combat training center. So we focused all of our effort on putting capability out there and making Black Horse, who was already, you know, the OPFOR, making them, who was already very proficient. We gave them the tools necessary to even bring the fight at a higher level. What we didn't do is fill the gap in home station training. And so, you know, that's why we think STE is the second revolution in training, because it provides that ability to replicate the environment, bring the enablers in, and then get the reps and sets before you ever go into that live environment. So, you know, we do work closely with all of the centers of excellence, and I'm not sure if Steve Michaels is here. I haven't seen him come in, but Steve Michaels took my place, so he works hand in glove with the centers of excellence, with their CDIDs, with their trainers, kind of outline all of this. CACT's job was to figure out the requirement and get it done and deliver the capability. So, I mean, from my standpoint, I think we are moving. Do we have it all right? Not yet, but we'll start figuring it out. But I think it is a big change in the way that we've been thinking about how to address things as we're going forward. I agree with you on that. So, Pete, did you want to?
I think a couple things. Well, Maria hit on everything I was thinking about, except there's one other area where, you know, at least on the comm side, one of the things that the Cyber Center of Excellence has really taken on is what we used to call signal universities, a lot of the installations. There's 12 different installations where they're establishing kind of a standard for ensuring kind of unit-focused training opportunities there, so folks can have a facility to go to that's kind of an extension of the COE, the Center of Excellence, to improve home station training and reps and sets and that type of thing. Another thing we're trying to leverage, you know, we've got a pilot we're working on right now with General Bassett and his team for Guard and Reserve, is we're trying to leverage cloud where we would containerize a lot of our mission command applications and systems, get it in a commercial cloud environment, and be able to connect all the armories in a way where they can get, again, trained and ready, where they don't have to try to maintain tactical infrastructure, server infrastructure that they can't maintain. So we're looking through some options there, which I think will address some of the training burden, at least for, you know, just mission command, battle staff kind of training and things like that.
Right. Because, sir, one of the things we saw at CAC-T was, as we prepared for a warfighter, you know, the Will Glazier sitting here, he used to oversee our National SIM Center. We used to have to put a, you know, CPX 1, 2, and then 3 in place, just so we could shake out all the bugs, get all our mission command information systems up, get the stamp, so that when we went to the warfighter, which, you know, was condensed 10, 14 days, it was 10 and 14 days, not trying to get your systems to work. And so, you know, if it's a burden, then we know we have to come back and readdress how do we do things to make it simpler, easier to use, commanders on the ground that can train, and not have to have a robust infrastructure to support it.
Well, I am glad that I heard that the Futures Command is putting major emphasis on this now, on taking all these individual systems, because even if you look at armor and infantry, they operate differently. They have different systems that they're using, and they got to all be integrated. And I'm glad to see that Futures Command is working on that, because you've got to.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Not after the fact. In fact, I think Pete and I can tell you about a warfighter, and so can Will Glazier, that took 10 months, 21 general officers, and almost an entire fleet of Army experts and contractors just to get us interoperable with, you know, our partners. So should not have to do that.
All right, thanks, sir. I'd like to, this question is directed to Ms. Garcia, and the question is, for a company without any contacts in NGA, what's the best way to initiate contact to help solve your mapping problems?
Wow.
Business card.
Yeah, exactly. Let me give you someone's business card. No. I think, you know, so one of the things that I think as an agency we're really focusing on is improving that connectivity on all networks, right? So how do we make sure that people all across the community are able to access us on unclassified, secret, and TS networks, right? I'm sure that many of you have heard before that sometimes, you know, within the intel community, we conduct a lot of transactions on that higher echelon network. But I know that one of the goals of the agency is really trying to push ourselves out and have that access at the unclassified and secret networks. So, I mean, I would recommend, right, starting there, going to our websites. There's a number of different capabilities available on all those networks and trying to reach out that way. If you are also a service partner, so we have NGA support teams located at all of the different services, as well as the intelligence community, you know, at DIA, at NSA. So I would also search for them, because that's their job, is really to be out there and helping you find answers to any type of question that you have. So we do have our Army NST chief here in the room. Yep, there he is. Yeah, so feel free to go find him after. He would love to help. Right? Yeah.
Thank you. And I truly have no shortage of questions, so I'm going to try to combine these two that have one world terrain written on them and send them your way, General Gervais. Okay. So the Army does not have a standard for 3D maps. So how does the Army take advantage of One World Terrain for 3D mapping? And when will One World Terrain be complete? When will every soldier be using it?
Yeah.
Just an easy one.
Okay, so, I think right now as we're taking a look at the 3D terrain strategy, what is necessary to move it forward? I think we've kind of laid through an approach on how we would actually do this. We've already kind of designed a process, everything from being able to collect data from any type of source, whether that's a national asset, whether that's from a drone that's being flown and units are already flying them, being able to process that. And we've been working on that so we can process that and put it into a commercial language, FBX, OBJ, or some other format. And then being able to take that and it's platform agnostic. So, we've already done that piece of it. The piece that we're working on is the distribution and storage of it. So that's one. Now, the data model. I think this is where we're working together and we have to understand what would be the data model. And could there be a data model that allows to meet training needs and then the operational needs? And we're looking at what are those data models available. We think there is one. There's a commercial standard that's out there that is endorsed by the Chronism Group, which is usually the big companies that commercially endorse things that the rest of the community will adopt. So we think that data model and that standard GLTF is available, which will allow us to capitalize on FBX and OBJ. And so we're working through that right now to bring that into the standards piece of that to say, here's what it is. We think this could be the data model. And then, of course, getting the attributions from the different communities that need to be able to use it. And so, we're working that piece right now across the geospatial community and the different players that need to understand that. So we think we're moving in the right direction. But let me back up to the second part of that question. Because we've kind of had this prototype, it's already in use. Units are already collecting content and data, and they're putting it into their Mission Command Information System. It happens to be TAC, and this is SEAL teams, this is Army SOF units, the Marines, and some of our Army divisions are already using it to collect content, and they're taking it and using it in terms of route planning, line of sight analysis, getting a better picture on the OPFOR right now in theater, or in a combat training center rotation, or even in theater. And so as they're collecting that content, that's helping us, one, distribution storage, two, fidelity, and giving us a good picture. But the thing that to me is most exciting is they're telling us what else they need to do with it. Because they're finding not just from a training, but from a tactical, in terms of, give me an example, the OPFOR at NTC is saying, hey, we were flying this drone, we collected this data, it's helping us here. They came back to us and said, we would really like to put this in D6A and see if we can get it in D6A because we want to be able to do change detection on a unit that's coming in and laying in their defenses. Okay, so they're seeing the potential, and so we're working it. So when will One World Terrain be finished? That's a great question, because guess what? We got to get to subterranean, we got to get to jungle, we got to get to mega cities. I got other things that we have to continue to solve.
Can I help you?
I think
you
the
can.
answer is never. I think we're
Yeah.
always going to be
Well,
in
hang on.
perpetual innovation here, and that's kind of the guidance we've been given from the boss.
I was making sure there's no S&T, our folks that said, you always have their RDT&E line in there that goes to
exactly.
nowhere, right?
Well, I'd say number two, from a data collection point of view, let's say we get One World Terrain down to this level of detail, 100% of the globe, which is an expensive proposition. Tomorrow, some of that data is old, right? And so it's going to be one of those things that I would say a data set's never complete. We have prioritization decisions to make when we talk about collecting of this data. Where do we want to focus to get that detailed data? And those priorities change over time. That's why we work with the COCOMs and others with NGA on what our priorities are. And then even when you get the data for the area you're interested in, what's the recency that you need that data to have? And over time, that changes. I'll tell you what, today we have data that's sometimes a decade old. And maybe in some places, a decade isn't too bad, but in other places, a month old is not sufficient.
Yeah, so let me just clarify the kind of the vision for One World Terrain. You know, do we absolutely have to have the entire globe, you know, in this database to say, okay, we're done? See, I would say absolutely not. You know, I think we prioritize, we know what we need to train, we know operationally where we need to be. I think the more important question, and what we're trying to do with One World Terrain, it's access. Can you gain access, and can you fly and get data and process it quick enough, and our quick enough is in 72 hours to allow for training to go. Because the relevancy is important in here. And our vision is that as we have this database, a unit goes in and goes, okay, I'm at Fort Hood, but look, I'm getting ready to go here. Okay, let me go in the database. When's the last time somebody's been there? Maybe it's been 6 months, and I go 6 months, oh, this is very good. I can pull this down, it can meet my, either my training or my mission rehearsal or getting ready for a deployment. Or it can go in and go, hey, there's nothing there. And then we can be able to pull down and get to some level of centimeters that's better than nothing. And see, unfortunately, usually what we have in the past is we either have that 2D map that, you know, everybody's doing their planning on and can't see from a 3-dimensional, or, as General Funk told me, you know, I never had the terrain I needed when I needed to deploy. So we think we can get something better than what we have now. And I think access is a bigger issue for me, just being able to access and get some level of data, not necessarily have the entire globe sitting in some database.
Yeah, and I would add on to that, right? You know, so the question I just got before about how do you get access to NGA, right? You know, I feel like in this future world being described, someone won't need to call NGA to get data or to download the maps. It'll be served to them in these completely immersive, you know, environments that they are able to, where all the data is merged and it's able to be collected, and all locations go back to the enterprise and be served back out to the user. But I think it's like we were talking about, you know, you really have this fine line between like what's good enough, what are the standards now, what's good enough, where do we keep innovating, and that job of innovation is really never done. You know, there's going to be new exquisite sensors that we're going to have to come up with new standards for in order to ingest them into these environments. And we're going to need to decide we want to serve them out quicker or in a different way than we had ever thought of before. And so I feel like this, you know, job will never be done, but we just all have to work together to do the best we can kind of in the moment.
So from the industry side of things, I frequently will use the line that I make the assumption that I don't control collection. And that's one of the key kind of design criteria that I use when I start thinking about how we attack a problem like this. And the awesome part about working with the people who do control collection is that it changes the options that you have available to you. So as General Gervais starts talking about access and being able to tackle that problem in scenarios where you can, then the what is good enough question changes, right? What's possible and what's good enough changes. At the same time, it's also really powerful from a technology perspective to think about at the really core kind of back end math level, how can you do the best with whatever you can get, right? And this again comes back to the policy question. So as we start talking about accuracy and precision and all these different things, you have to have some baseline for sure. But you also have to recognize each source for what it's good at, where it's available, when it was available, what resolution is it available at, what spectral resolutions or spectral bands does it have available to you. There are a million kind of different nuances of the kind of characteristics of data sets that are available to you, and they all have benefits in certain regards. And so one of the really important things, and part of this is on industry, part of this is on the government, the people who understand kind of the mission uses, is understanding how each source, each potential source can map into the larger vision that is One World Terrain, right? Because there may be scenarios where you want even better than even better resolution than what you can get from flying a drone. Or maybe you're in a scenario where you need to be able to get your material classification down to, like, no kidding, this is the chemical composition of whatever it is that I'm looking at. Wonderful world of hyperspectrals can help you in that regard. We can talk about that in a different venue. But it's this amazing time, and this again is me getting overly enthusiastic, but it's this amazing time where remote sensing is in a renaissance, right? So the amount of data, the variety of data, the access to data in places that you never really would have thought data would exist is just, it's every day is a new day. I mean, you start looking at scenarios where you think of North Korea as a denied environment, and then you go to YouTube and you can find a 360-degree dash cam video of a Russian Yandex collector driving around the streets of Pyongyang, right? You can go to YouTube and pull that down. So this is, I mean, it's a complete, it's, in my world, the really powerful part about One World Terrain is that it's bigger than a data set, right? It's all about creating a capability that recognizes the need for a baseline, but also recognizes the fact that you got to be able to build on that. You got to be able to augment as data is available in different places. You got to be able to manage how that data gets to the people who need it and understand what people need in different scenarios.
Next question is for Mr. Blom. Is there a potential for one standard to be a barrier to shared analysis and operational planning in coordination with international partners, intergovernmental agencies, NGOs, et cetera? Isn't One World Terrain an and capability and not a the capability? Isn't the addition of One World Terrain a new format to the standard shareable geospatial foundation?
Multiple part question. So,
Multiple parts.
I'm glad someone's read some of our geospatial policies and so standard shareable geospatial foundation has really been the approach when we talk about the Army Geospatial Enterprise that we have. And there is no single standard in that foundation. There's multiple standards, but guess what? There is a gap on the 3D standard. And so we do need to add that standard, and that's something that this community is going to work at. And when we work on figuring out what that standard is, we do it in conjunction with the developers of our Mission Command, Intel Systems, of course, NGA being a huge player in that. I think there's always risks, and we always have to look at where is the commercial space when we decide and pick a standard. Because there's a balance between standardization and innovation. Katerina and I, we were actually talking about that before the panel. And so this is where our challenge is, and we look for inputs from industry as we try to make those decisions in a smart fashion. And so you heard General Gervais mention GLTF as being a standard we're looking at in this 3D space. We want feedback. So give Katerina, give General Gervais, give us the feedback if that's the standard that you're looking at. We're not going to come up with our own. We're not going to develop a separate standard for ourselves. So could it be a barrier? If we don't do it right, it absolutely could. We need industry participation to make sure we don't make it a barrier. Coalition partners, I'm actually glad someone brought that up. And so we have interactions all the time with coalition partners about how do we go forward on geospatial. So in Pete Gallagher's line of effort too, when he talks about the common operating environment, it's Mission Command. It's more than just geospatial data, but the interoperability for us to collaborate and partner with our partners. So we do and will continue to keep our coalition partners into these discussions. And is One World Terrain an and or the capability? I think Isaac just talked, he just used the word, I wrote it down, source. So even One World Terrain is not a single source. The data we get from NGA is not a single source. Now we put that into this foundation together. I add data to it when we fly a Buckeye mission in theater, right? And we'll add this one world terrain to that. What we want is, we want all that data to be shareable across all these domains.
Yeah, and so on the SSGF, I mean, look, we're just taking that as a baseline, and our layers are being laid on top of it. So it's not replacing it at all. In fact, we start with all of that data that's already there, and use it on top of it. So it's not an either or. It's it's an and in my mind, and a source.
Okay, next for General Gallagher. We want to quickly view tactical terrain with the highest levels of precision and accuracy with the visual richness, such as with Buckeye imagery. What changes are needed for data, network, and transport layers for one world terrain to include storage on physical, local devices or the cloud?
There's a lot packed into that question. I don't know exactly. I think we're going to, first I think we got to get it on the systems once we determine what it is, because and get it into our mission command systems and our intelligence systems, and then analyze the performance. There's a lot of work that can be done in the lab. A lot of work I talked to Maria before about trying to get some of the smart engineers at Aberdeen to take a good hard look at how this is performing on the network, and run through some models and simulation on kind of latency and bandwidth challenges, and working our way through that. But I think the perfect mix of cloud versus edge computing, we're still working our way through what that will look like going forward. But I think as technology emerges, if you just think about all the hype right now surrounding 5G and the smart devices in the future, there's going to be a lot of computing power on the next generation smartphones. There's going to be a lot more data. I'm not too worried about the compute and storage aspect of it, because I think the footprint is going to go down, and we're going to have a lot more capacity of compute and storage. It's that transport and the data flow, and being able to manage very limited, perhaps very limited pipes. And I think it goes back to what Kateri said there earlier about having the right algorithms that allows the data to flow very efficiently through that, through those transport pipes. So it's going to be compression algorithms. It's going to be just kind of bits and bytes flowing, only send what is absolutely necessary to get that precision. And I'm not sure exactly what that looks like, but the only way we're going to figure this out is kind of get things in the lab and really work our way through that.
And I would also just add something that, that's also very interesting when you talk about accurate, precise data, right, is how much do you incorporate, things like crowdsourcing in. And that's something, when you talk about like what is your kind of perfect database that you have, and what are you considering authoritative data, right? So how do you take in, some of the opinions of the users, right? The information that they are seeing firsthand, and use that in order to go back and update, the cloud, and update all these databases that you're holding at your enterprise level. And so I think that's going to be, a very interesting challenge as well, because we've been so used to thinking that the authoritative content comes from the center, comes from the enterprise. But I think we have to really make that paradigm shift and understand that, that it can come from other places. And so I know that, our agency is doing some of that with projects like GNOME, if any of you have heard of it, which is done at a 2D scale, but it's really using, crowdsourcing to do 2D mapping. And so how do we make that, how do we bring that to the 3D level as well, where you can take information, whether it's on interiors of buildings, or even just using, on the outside, using some of that, maybe a photo you take of a building that now can get fed back in and update and make that authoritative content something new and much more exquisite. And so I think, I don't think that's a solved problem, but it's certainly one that I think that is going to be worthwhile for the community to tackle.
So I'm going to add one thing. So I think you just heard two consistent answers that said there's not going to be one solution to this. There's a lot of work being done and research yet to be done on how to kind of what the right and optimum balance is for what gets transmitted, what gets cached, how do you manage smart caches, how do you manage diff sets from one to the other, how do you manage authoritative versus non-authoritative in different scenarios. And really, it's going to come down to each scenario and having the flexibility at an enterprise level to be able to support a bunch of different scenarios. So you can envision a scenario where so one of the key so we talked about automation earlier. So one key piece of the automation puzzle that we've been working on for a long time is how do you automatically take new data and register it against your foundation in an accurate way to the point where you can characterize how accurate it now is against some authoritative foundation. It's critical. So I'm going to use two examples of deploying that technology that are completely different and end up with completely different answers to the question of how do you transport data. So on the one hand, we have, you can think of a program like Maven that's out there pulling real-time video content, and they want to apply AI and machine learning algorithms to automatically extract all the features out of those videos, generate these feature databases that can then be used for analysis to identify patterns of life and people's behavior, and ultimately automated target recognition, all sorts of other things. And one of the critical things that they've come to identify is that the accuracy of the data inherently leads to the accuracy of the features that you're extracting, which then creates a dependency for the accuracy of the analysis you can do after the fact. So this registration capability deployed in an enterprise environment where you have all these video feeds coming back to a central source where you can apply this in the cloud as just kind of a standard service makes a lot of sense. But that exact same capability, that exact same registration capability, all the math that we're doing to figure out where that feed, that full motion video feed exists on the ground is the same math to figure out where that sensor is in space, in time. So if you think about, rather than doing that processing in the cloud at the enterprise level, all of a sudden you think about deploying that on the platform with a local cached version of your foundation database, and you're all of a sudden you have a completely GPS independent mechanism for determining the location of your platform in space using sensors that are already on your platform, right? Two completely different use cases, both reliant on the same technology, the same fundamental foundational data, and ultimately we're going to have to think about how we support both of those, right?
I think this ties back to some of my opening comment about just having to work through the data architecture. When I talk about that, where do you store it, where you're going to process it, those are decisions. They're not, we have to develop new technology. We just have to decide where in this battle space we want to do those things. And it comes to one of the questions, and maybe it was you, sir, that talked about system engineering. These are system engineering kind of problems.
Okay. This one, I'm going to ask you to start with Mr. Blum, but I suspect some of the panel may want to weigh in. So it specifically asks, how is the Army mapping subterranean environments?
Yes.
Either robotics, sonar equipment, and with interagency partners, are we doing this with interagency partners with subterranean expertise? For example, the Israelis.
Yeah, I meant to say international partners, and I apologize for my handwriting.
So there is a lot of work in the science and technology area looking at subterranean. It's being done, I know in the ERDEC, not in my lab, but down in Vicksburg. So I'm not an expert of the specific technologies they're using, but I think they're using some of the ones you talk about. Certainly, we need to leverage what's happening in other nations. And so the science technology community has a lot of opportunities for collaboration across nations. And I know you're correct in this case where the Israelis have a lot in this area. So we are working in that direction. Did I miss part of the question?
No.
And if you're looking for a point of contact, I can talk to you afterwards.
Yeah.
Well, I know there's some other projects, DARPA has some projects that are ongoing, taking a look at subterranean. If you also look at, there's a lot of projects that are in support of the 2nd Infantry Division in USFK kind of taken a look at that technology. We've also seen some other technology that's working in theater right now. So, you know, I think there's a lot of different capabilities. I think it's, you know, there's some hard problem sets, whether it's subterranean, whether it's like, for example, jungle. You know, how do you replicate a jungle in 3D and get to that level of detail? I mean, you know, because, I mean, we're going to have to fight there. So how do you get down to that level, and what are the different capabilities or technologies that could come to bear? But then, you know, what are, like agriculture, what are other countries already doing, you know, and going after and taking a look at it? Because I think, you know, it's solvable. I think technology will get us there. It's just, you know, how do we capitalize and leverage everything that's being done? Because we're all trying to really get after the same thing.
Yeah, I will add, so not to go you know, too far into the subject, but to talk broadly. So one of the things that we are leading within the community, so within NGA, is a high resolution 3D geomet need study. And so one of the big goals of the study is to get a better understanding of what our partners need from 3D. And so I think that these are two mission cases that are very interesting and that obviously aren't solved. So whether it's subterranean, you know, identification, or whether we're talking about foliage penetration, you know, what are the needs that exist that we are not able to answer, that we are having challenges answering. And so I can give you my contact information after if you're interested in kind of contributing some requirements to that study.
And Ms. Garcia, if you'll take this one on. With increased emphasis on joint interoperability, are the geospatial requirements standardized across the services to enable a common operating environment across the services?
Did I hear the audience wanting to answer? No. Yeah, so I will say, you know, some of the conversations that I had with our leadership in you know, preparing for this panel, we're really talking about interoperability and the need to make all of our data interoperable. I don't know that I'm really the greatest person to answer this question as far as the details, but I do know that that is you know, one of the big goals moving forward. So, you know, one of our NGA's 2025 strategy, if any of you want to go out and read it, talks about
excellent. It's excellent.
Talks about partnerships, right, and delivering trusted data. And so I think it's really hard to say that we can achieve that without making everything interoperable. And so I think that that's really going to be a huge challenge, you know, a heavy lift. But I'm eager to be partnering with the CFT leads here, as well as, you know, our AGC colleagues in industry to figure out how to best do that. And obviously that comes, one of our favorite things is, you know, at the agency is standards. Like, how do you make the standards with your partners? How do you develop them together in order to make everything interoperable and make it function better? So not standards for standards' sake, but standards to enable interoperability in GeoInt.
We had one of the standard charts I sometimes use is 5 or 6 different mission command intelligence systems, all using the same standard. And then we showed pictures of how those standards were shown in each of those systems, all vastly different. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes, and I know this is what people always want to hear, sometimes we have to not only enforce a standard, but be detailed in the profiles that we apply to those standards. And that's one of the things that we also work on.
We have about culminated, and I apologize for not getting to all of the questions that you have in the time left, but I want to make sure our panel chair has the opportunity to close out. But I do thank everyone for their attention. We had some really good questions. A lot of them were certainly packed, and they will no doubt help us with our quest to be designated the Panel of the Year for the Association of the United States Army 2019. Don't forget to vote. Mr. Blum.
It'll probably be because of our best dressed panelists down at the end there.
Oh, down at the end.
Hold on.
You-
The nerve.
We got to
The
take
nerve.
a vote by show of
Undue
applause. Is it Isaac or is it Cattery?
Yay! I won. I really am never going to let him live this down. So
It's true,
thank
she
you all.
won't.
Who votes for Isaac, though? We didn't-
Those were pity claps.
All right, dance off. You have to do a dance off.
I will answer one final question that General Walker handed me. I'll partially answer. The answer was, where do I see future payloads on the Buckeye system, and does the present Buckeye satisfy our LiDAR requirements? I think one of the things I'm looking forward to in the future is, as we work through Army Futures Command and what our science and technology goals are, I think this is an area I'm going to start putting on the table for the next generation. But I'm also looking for your thoughts. We need to have more standoff range in our sensors. We need to see through foliage. General Gervais talked about needing to see under the canopy. So there are things I think we need to advance in those capabilities. As closing comments, well, first of all, thank you to all my panel members and General Walker for moderating us today. This has been a fascinating discussion for me. I'm relatively new to the geospatial community, got to AGC a little over a year ago. A couple final foot stomps is, to me, geospatial is an enterprise data asset. And it's a shame that we haven't had that as an enterprise data asset in the training community with all the different formats. And this is an opportunity to fix that so we can train as we fight. The fact that we're going to do this through partnering, and the fact that we are all talking together outside of this panel on a daily basis is what's going to get us there. Data, data, data. We give NGA our data requirements, working with the G2 on a consistent basis, and they come back and say, yes, no, kinda, with answers. We can never have enough data to solve all these issues. We need to prioritize our data requirements so NGA gives us what they need, and then the Army can augment as we desire or see fit. And we're going to use more and more commercial data as we go forward. But that's nothing new, but it's just expounding on a daily basis. So thanks, Isaac, for representing that community. I want to thank you for your time here today on this sometimes technical discussion, but it seems like a lot of you from the questions know the technology maybe better than I do. But again, thank you very much.